Give me liberty or give me death. A famous quote for sure. As long as there are rights being infringed upon, there will be those who fight the injustice. The topic of Hong Kong protests are important because human rights are being violated, and we should stand up for equal rights and freedoms for all. The Hong Kong protests are a group of people fighting for their freedom from China, and they aren't the first to do so. To cover this, we're going to take a look at the premise of the protests, current events, and the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. To begin, the Hong Kong protesters have a lot they're hoping to accomplish based on what has been happening. According to the New York Times, Hong Kong was a British colony until 1997 and was handed back to China under a policy known as One Country, Two Systems. They are allowed to keep their autonomy until at least 2047, but people report that China is slowly scraping away their freedoms little by little. They tried to pass the extradition bill earlier this year, which would have allowed Hong Kong to send criminal suspects to mainland China court systems, which is currently ruled by the Communist Party, which wouldn't have allowed for a fair trial. To combat this, they led a peaceful march, which also led to police brutality. The police beat the protesters with batons, and they used about 150 canisters of tear gas. Now that we understand the basic background of the premise, let's discuss the current events. The protests are currently still going strong. The protesters have about 5 demands, which include the withdrawal of the extradition bill, which it has, but they say it was too little too late, protections of the protesters and those who have been arrested, and complete universal suffrage. The protests have become increasingly violent. An example of that is, according to BBC News, on October 1st, an 18-year-old was shot in the chest with a live bullet, one of 6 rounds that were fired by police. Protesters also fought officers with poles, petrol bombs, and other projectiles. The Chinese president had this to say about the protests: any attempt to divide China would end in bodies smashed and bones ground to powder. The streets are a dangerous place. They are fighting for their rights and for a system of democracy against the wishes of China. The violence may not stop anytime soon. Now that we have talked about the current events in Hong Kong, let's discuss the most important protests against China that happened in the past. The Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 that led to a bloody massacre. The protesters, mostly consisting of students, called for a more open and democratic government with free press and free speech. They disrupted a visit of the Soviet Union Prime Minister, and martial law was declared. According to History.com, on June 4th and 5th of 1989, live rounds were fired into crowds, and an estimated hundreds to thousands of protesters were killed in the Tiananmen Square massacre, and as many as 10,000 were arrested. And this picture shows a man standing in front of tanks, proving that people are willing to do whatever it takes to have freedom once again. China is trying to cover up the Tiananmen Square massacre. They expunged more than 3,500 words from the Chinese internet to make sure that people don't know about what happened. And any people who try to go to the square on any of the anniversaries are prevented from doing so to pay their respects. In conclusion, the Hong Kong protests are a group of people fighting for their freedom from China, and they aren't the first to do so. To illustrate this, we looked at the premise of the protests, current events, and the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. We all deserve the right to have a place to which we can belong to. We all need to fight together for the betterment of humanity against depression. Thank you.